Have you read McIntyre's After Virtue?
Yeah, one of the best. There are two philosophers in the modern world, three that are worth reading that will go down into the annals of the history of philosophy. McIntyre is one of them. Harry Frankfurt's another of them, and Charles Taylor is the third in my book.
I was never a big Frankfurt fan. I've read a few of his books, but I didn't like him particularly much.
You got to know how to apply him. You got to be able to take and apply all the concepts that he's developing into an ethical context so that you understand when he says that you have first order desires. For instance, I have a socially conditioned and even natural desire to always eat barbecue chicken pizza. But I also have a second order desire to think reasonably and reflexively about this, asking whether or not that will actually be beneficial to me.
Right.
Looking at my now dad bod, the answer was no, and I should have taken that way serious a little sooner.
That's okay. The dad bod it's a look.
Oh, wives don't dig it.
Well, I'm just not going to disagree with you on that one.
Yeah, there's no disagreeing.
No perspective on that.
They don't care. They don't care. But
I couldn't possibly comment.
I have emailed a former student who was a football player, huge, in shape. I go, dude, you need to work out with me because I need a workout partner again. I'm tired of the dad bod that's tired of life by 6 p.m. at night.
Right. Well, hey, I mean, if it makes you feel any better, there are days when I'm tired of life at 6 p.m. So. And I'm like 19.
Oh, man, just wait till they have kids.
I know. Yeah. Anyways, let's get down to it.
Let's do it.
I want to just preface, I don't think I've done a good enough job of like saying what the actual project of this whole podcast thing is.
Sure.
So I just want to take a minute to do that. So to everybody who's watching, we are back for part 3 of our Theodicy for Dummies class with Dr. Eric Hall. Today we are taking on chapters 7 and 8 of his book, The Homebrewed Christianity, Guide to God, Everything You Needed to Know About the Almighty. The reason we have to read this book first before diving into David Bentley Hart's material is because we have to have a sufficient understanding of the God that we are dealing with when we enter that book. Because that book is, in and of itself, like we could spend an entire series on that.
Absolutely.
But we'd be spending years on it if we didn't first have a sufficient understanding of God. So the last few classes, we went through first the different concepts of God that we find culturally. And then we sorted through that and we synthesized them, basically. And so now we are, the 2 chapters we're going through today are Becoming a More Consistent Atheist and The Philosopher's Preference of PCs to Apple. So let's get down to it. So this chapter 7, Becoming a More Consistent Atheist, why don't you just give us a little bit of a summary, and then we'll dive into the real material.
Yeah, let me contextualize. Again, because we talked a lot of metaphysics and a lot of technical things about God in the previous chapters. And I know that gets frustrating for people. So now I want to begin, I want to draw them into where this project is going, because it leads into something like what David Bentley Hart is doing and asking, who is God? And who is God to allow something like a tsunami to emerge and take 250,000 lives, right? So we've been setting up what's called the philosopher's God so far. It's the God of reason, the God that in some ways is undeniable. And we'll talk about what I think that undeniability means and doesn't mean in this coming chapter. But I got to read this quote by Pope Benedict, because in some ways it's what the entire book is based on. I have it on page 12. I have it again at the end of the book, I think around page 199 or something. But it goes like this. This God of the philosophers, whose pure eternity and unchangeability had excluded any relation with the changeable and transitory, now appeared to the eye of faith as the God of men, who is not only the thought of all thoughts, the eternal mathematics of the universe, but also agape, the power of creative love. So what we've done is we've set up, if you will, the first part of this, the first part of this quote. We have talked about who God is in God's unchangeability. We've come to grips, or at least started to come to grips with what it means for God to know us. It means for God to think through God's self, because God is the highest and God needs nothing other than God's self. We understand God now as a pure intellect who is its own thinking and knowing. And indeed, God is order itself that grounds and sources all the order of the universe. That's the God that we've come to grips with so far, which makes for interesting questions with regard to the power and problem of evil. For instance, is God also the source of evil? We'll talk about that.
Right.
But where we're going is where Pope Benedict goes, in that he says Christians in and through Christ reinterpreted. They had an option. He sets it up as an option. They had an option to either interpret the God of Christ in and through, say, Zeus and the other Greco-Roman gods, because, if you will, the Hebrew scriptures were not clear enough in terms of their conceptual language. Or they could go the way of the academics and the philosophers, and they chose the way of the philosophers because this is the God of truth, and reinterpreted the distant God of truth into the very ground of creative love that ought not probably to love us, but does love us, that need not save the world, but comes to us nonetheless canonically in love and with a gratuitous spirit to grant us eternal life, something of that sort. So I just wanted to make that transition for us.
Yeah. Good. So this chapter, Becoming a More Consistent Atheist, deals with a lot about scientific misconceptions. And almost, I think by the end of the chapter, we almost come to the conclusion that science isn't the way to talk about God.
That's correct, yeah.
Yeah.
We never need to bring in we never need to bring in scientific language to legitimately talk about God. And even if we do, it's only at the level of seeing order within the world that it makes any sense to do so. What we want to do is avoid what we call the God of the gaps. See, science can't explain this material phenomenon. We have to posit a God who created that, therefore there is a God.
Right.
Well, just a matter of 10 years before those types of dilemmas are solved on the scientific side of things.
A lot of what was coming to mind during when I was rereading this chapter was Hart's book, The Experience of God.
Yep.
Where he outlines being, consciousness, and bliss as the three scientifically irreducible parts of our lives that can't be explained away, that have to be attributed to God. So hopefully we can touch a little bit on that as we get through chapter today.
It's been a while since I've read that book, so you'll have to lead me through that discussion.
Yeah, I mean, my understanding of it is not probably not deep enough. I think it should just be a good outline that we can reference to.
One way to think of it, and this is I'm absolutely on board with Hart on this point. Well, actually, there may be some discrepancies here, but that's for a different time. It comes to a different conclusion, beauty of the infinite. But I think we have a very reductionistic notion of what knowledge is.
Right.
And what I mean by that idea is this: we take one small phenomenon in the notion of knowledge and we turn it into the whole. So it's like looking at this pencil, because I'm a philosopher and we always got to look at things on our desk right in front of us. And it's saying the whole pencil is found in the eraser here. Nothing else matters. So let's look at the eraser, solely focus on that eraser, and that's what we'll do. And that's what we're doing with our forms of knowledge today. We reduce it to the scientific, or the naturally scientific, we should say, because it's been, frankly, really successful in creating awesome things like the solar panels I got on my house, this technology that allows us to communicate, and several forms of antibiotics that let us live after we get sepsis.
Right. And part of that is perhaps a misconception on the Christian half, which is a misunderstanding of what faith means.
Mm-hmm.
And in that misunderstanding, we sort of give off to society the wrong idea. And you said on page 121, by faith, we usually mean blind-willed belief.
Mm-hmm.
That's not really what faith is, right?
I don't think so. I think faith is an entire orientation. And when we say blindly willed, when I say that, blindly willed belief, what we usually mean is that by my own moral bootstraps, I have willed myself to believe this thing that I probably shouldn't believe. And because I've done that, God's going to credit me for that for all eternity, for being so cool that I can go against reason so as to believe in X, Y, or Z. Right. That's kind of what we tend to mean by the notion of faith. But faith is something different. In traditional theology, faith is bound up with the notion of grace. And faith is something that one doesn't have simply on one's own. But it's a draw. Someone has drawn you in already into a set of assumptions whereby you're able to take seriously the insane statement that a cross-dead Jewish man is the trajectory of the universe. And resurrected. I always forget that.
Yes. I preached on this 2 weeks ago. I did a whole sermon on faith 2 weeks ago.
Good, man. Yeah, I think I read it online. It looked great.
Oh, did you really? Oh, thank you. That means a lot. I preached this weekend at Kingstown as well. Kingstown is our satellite church.
Awesome.
And so hopefully Jason will post that sermon as well.
Cool. Yeah, that's great, man.
But anyways, but for the science worshiper, belief or faith is actually, before we do that, what is a science worshiper?
Science worshiper, if you've ever heard of the new atheists, they usually say you shouldn't believe in religion because it means ignoring rational thought, which, again, like the pencil being reduced to an eraser, is like saying the only type of reasonable and rational thought we can have is that which is empirically measurable and verifiable. In other words, we can see it or we can measure it in the world, and we can come to a constant understanding of a model that we can then interpret the material world through. That's all we have from the science worshiping standpoint. So if it's not done through the natural sciences, which indeed measures the constancy of the material world, then it's not knowledge. Of course, right. The whole thing rests on an inherent contradiction. You cannot, if the criterion for truth is measurability, then this criterion for truth, simply measurability and repeatability, this criterion for truth itself can't work itself out because it's not measurable and it's not repeatable in the ways that, say, material data is. It's quite simply a concrete contradiction in terms of how we think through these things.
Right. And an example there is consciousness, which so far we haven't been able to reduce to that. But it's something that we know to be a true factor of our lives.
Sure.
And something that differentiates us among reasoning beings.
If I remember how Bentley Hart argues for this in The Being of God, he says, you cannot get simple unity of thought and consciousness out of a multiplicity of brain cells functioning together. We think of a bottom-up approach to our consciousness in the sense that our consciousness arises in light of the material that allows it to arise. But he actually makes the other argument. He says that our brain functioning is in some ways a reflection of the consciousness that is prior to it. He's arguing like a good
Right.
Greek Orthodox Christian here in my book, and I
Yeah.
agree with him.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a really compelling argument. And it goes back to that being sort of drawn up in, like in faith.
Mhm.
Our consciousness is already speaking to a being drawn up into something else.
And it says something about the body too, that the goodness of the body is it's being drawn up into a broader life
Mhm.
that the body doesn't get to create but participate in. We are our bodies in many ways, so
Mhm.
that's a good thing too.
Mhm. So now that we have clarified what a science worshiper is, let's say for science worshiper, faith or belief is in a truth which you say emerges within a so-called scientific context.
Yeah.
Why don't you explain that?
So what are you thinking of here?
Like what for faith, for us Christians,
Mm-hmm.
faith is being drawn up into something else.
Yeah.
But for a science worshiper, faith is belief in a truth within a context.
Yeah. So if we're to ascribe something like faith to the idea of science worshiping, it's the notion that they have a blindly willed belief in the power of scientific reasoning to think through and solve all dilemmas. So they're taken into this assumption. It's frankly an unexamined assumption. Like I was saying before, it's concretely contradictory. It cannot even uphold to the standard of reason itself, in at least in the sense of consistency. And so there's a blindly willed belief in the power of scientific thought to solve all things. Now, here's what no one should hear. No one should hear that I'm in any way dogging on the empirical sciences. Again, I got to take like a 5-minute warm shower without my daughter crushing a cat or something because she was able to watch Daniel Tiger for those 5 minutes. This is all technologically based, grounded in certain scientific formulations, right? But that's not all there is to life. The constancy of the material world is not all there is to explore in life. And so what we do is we exclude. What's that?
That's a good line. You should write it down.
Perhaps I will, yeah. What we do is we exclude reasonable and rational talk of God and what it would mean to discuss the God of reason because we're so used to simply saying, well, that's just something of belief. And science doesn't care about that anyway, so why would we care? So the point of this chapter in this regard is to say, you see everything we just talked about? I'm actually not full of crap. I might be full of crap, but at least my desire to talk about God in these ways, they're not full of crap. You're just bound up with a cultural sense of science worship that disallows us to take these kinds of questions seriously. Mm-hmm. And in fact, at the beginning of the chapter, I make the argument, and I think it's true, that from the standpoint of reason, at least a very particular notion of God, Miyagi God, is very easy to affirm reasonably and rationally.
Yeah. Good. So let's talk about different types of truth.
Yeah.
I'm going to skip forward a few pages here, and then we can go back.
You got it.
But I want to get that discussion out of the way. Trying to find it here. Sorry, give me.
No, you're fine.
Hot second. Okay, so let's go through a few terms. Unqualified truth.
Okay.
Probability, reasoned opinion.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, let's just run through those real quick. First, so let's go in a gradation here. Let's go probability, reasoned opinion, and unqualified truth.
Sounds good. So I'd say reasoned opinion and probability function at the same level.
Okay.
And I'd want to distinguish those from what I'd call preference or mere opinion. So when we talk about our opinions today, and we'll start here, what we usually mean is if I'm talking about something like God, I'm talking about some preference that I have. So if I want to affirm God, I prefer to. but there's no reason behind it. If I don't want to affirm God, then I simply don't prefer to. But there's no real maybe there's reason behind that in a science worshiping culture. So mere opinion is quite simply what we prefer to believe based on where we were born, how much we like or dislike our parents, and right. I mean, that's kind of what this stuff is. It's what Louis C.K., I can't remember the bit, he calls them beliefies, right? I got my beliefies. And I kind of like them. I don't really care about them that much. In some way, I mean, but it's also what we always come back to, like in an Ethics 101. Hey, right. You got your opinion, I got my opinion, and that's just how it is, even though this is already a statement of some sort of knowledge claim.
Right.
So then we jump into what I would call reasoned opinion. This is where most of our knowledge claims take place. Mm-hmm. We have an opinion, which means that it is not apodictically certain. It is not true.
Big word there.
I know. I'm breaking it down. Don't worry. It is not true to the degree that I can affirm it with certainty. Mm-hmm. I love my wife. That's true, and I think it's a reasoned opinion, but there might be actions that I could do in the future that would contradict that. I hope not, and I will try my best to stem that tide, right? But there's knowledge of my love for my wife there that is reasoned opinion. Right. This is also, I know that sounds so cruel, right? But
ooh, yeah.
We just have to be honest.
I hope she's not watching.
She's used to me. If there's a reasonable opinion to have, it's that she's now used to me.
Right.
Scientific truth takes place at the level of reasoned opinion, because what you're doing in the sciences is you're experimenting with the material world, you're creating something like a hypothesis, a probable model that will help you to explain the data at hand, and then you're projecting it into other like data. So it's actually scientific knowledge actually takes place at the level of reasoned opinion, which is why you have people like Kuhn's writing about scientific revolutions. Certain opinions, reasoned opinions, and they were very reasonable to have, you find certain outlying data that now needs to be incorporated in, and it revolutionizes the whole field in which you're existing, so that you had to take all those previous models and draw them up into a sort of new and higher ideal, something that re-explains things.
Right.
So most of life takes place at the level of reasoned opinion. We walk around, we have reasonable ways of thinking and opining about things, and especially if we begin to think through them, reflect on ourselves and how silly we sometimes are, and reflect on ourselves and how our desires tend to affect us, we can, if you will, funnel these opinions, these reasoned opinions, far away from your preference into a sort of type of knowledge that is on its way to the truth without ever having the truth in its fullness.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes. And I want to jump off that and talk about truth.
Yeah.
Truth, you say on 125, truth is a correspondence between thought and being. Mm-hmm. That is quite a claim to make. And I am aware of several philosophers who would disagree with that.
Oh, absolutely. Most at this point do.
Right. Well, and okay. So give us the defense of that. So if you're of the opinion that most people will disagree with you on that, then yeah.
I think they're in a concrete contradiction again. If you claim that what you're saying has no correspondence to reality, then you're describing a reality that you think is the case, that our thought does not have any correspondence to reality. You see, we get in this problem. This is part of the issue, and a philosopher named Bernard Lonergan unfolds this. Philosopher, mm-hmm. Jesuit theologian. He says, we think of, our problem is that we think of the real as what he calls the already out there now real. Namely, material things, so that when I can throw this cup against the wall and it breaks, I go, see, that was real. So we think of it from this perspective whereby there has to be some sort of confrontation, a physicalist understanding of the real. And so we get into these questions of perception. So am I really perceiving this cup and its blueness, or is that just an act of the human mind that I force onto the cup that is really something else altogether entirely? Well, that only makes sense if you don't take seriously the idea that your very questioning itself, that the types of questions you ask are themselves a part of the real order in which you exist.
Mm-hmm.
That makes sense so far?
Right.
So when we say that I cannot know the real, I've already made a definitive claim into knowing the real. I say, I cannot know the real, and I know this to be the case that I cannot know the real. And my question then becomes, well, what are you doing in that act of, even if you're claiming not to know the real, what are you actually doing in the act? Well, you're claiming some sort of correspondence with regard to the way you think and what the real is. Now, you've gotten it wrong. There is no correspondence there because you've precisely phrased it wrongly. But it reveals to us what truth actually is. And that is, we look at the world through a reasoned opinion. We'll go back to that notion for the most part. And we have a certain correspondence to the world. We get parts of it and we don't get others. And our usual mistake is we take those parts we understand and we blow it up into an understanding of the whole. Look at any politician and how they function. They understand one myopic part of the world and then blow it up into a knowledge of the whole world and how the whole world could function, right? Mm-hmm. When I worked construction, that's what my foreman did with regard to illegal immigration, right? He knew how to build a house. And so all of a sudden he was an expert on how to deal with, quote unquote, please forgive me for this term, the illegals, right? Not that I approve of that term. That just tends to be the type of thinking that emerged. So this is where we spend our lives. I think that if we deny that we have some sort of grasp of the real, we're already claiming to grasp the real. And then it leads us into a more specific truth claim, which we can get to momentarily, the unqualified truth claim.
Mm-hmm. So just one little pushback.
Yeah, please.
People like Heidegger would argue that perhaps the truth of the thing, like the truth of my Yeti here, is not in the Yeti itself, nor in the breaking of the Yeti when I throw it against the ground.
That's right.
Rather, it is, the truth of it is most there and most grasped in the action that it performs. So when I drink from the Yeti, that is when the Yeti is the most Yeti.
Well, and there's a couple things actually to say about Heidegger in this point. You're absolutely right. That's how he argues in Being and Time. And my counter, I actually agree with that point, but that's actually not to say that the way that we define things isn't true as well. He tries to make the argument that because our definitions are culturally proclaimed, that in some way, he's sort of the foundation of this type of argument that goes through Jacques Derrida, et cetera.
Right.
That therefore
I was about to bring it up.
that we can't know these things. But of course, my counterclaim is, well, then how are you claiming to know that the truth of the thing is found in the enacting of it? I think it's a combination here in that, it's most true in the acting, but I'd even push it to another degree in a way that Heidegger doesn't want to. The truth of all things are found in the true itself, which is God. And God's creative love and active ordering of the world. We'll come back to active ordering later, because that's not a strong sense, but so there's that. But there's also in his later work, the Beiträge, published posthumously, where he was most frustrated in his Introduction to Metaphysics and several other works of his, what he was most interested in doing was unleashing the phenomenon whereby truth as correctness could emerge. And for that, he means quite simply to be given over to the phenomenon and to allow it to arise without projecting onto it. And I can go there until, again, we simply say that we're already projecting and talking about these things, articulating, developing. So we have to move to a point where we say that we socialize ourselves out of truth because you've been socialized in this way, boys are taught to wear blue, as I'm wearing now. Girls are taught to wear pink, as my daughter is probably wearing. And therefore, we have to reject these ideas. What we have to instead unfold is this notion that actually truth itself is socialized. And we have to enter into the articulations and socializations of truth, but we also have to be willing to enter into those questions with a sense of truth, asking which ones get it right and which ones get it wrong. Mm-hmm. Which leads us back to truth as correctness.
Right. Okay, so when you say truth is socialized, I think of that as contrary to the idea of unqualified truth.
So, yeah.
So why don't you first say what unqualified truth is, and then why or why not the two are opposed to each other?
Sure. So an unqualified truth is a truth that I can affirm in any and all circumstances, in any universe, in any space-time continuum, etc. It gets at, if in some ways, the very essence of the real, right? That's the type of insane statement I'm making, but really all I'm doing is going back to ancient Greco-Roman thought and the types of statements we all thought we were making.
Right. I mean, you can find that up through Kant even.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely. So here's an example of an unqualified truth, and we'll start there, and then we'll go into the socialization. And I think that unqualified truths tend to reveal themselves when the very thing that we're affirming or trying to affirm ends up being contradicted. We rest on prior assumptions in that. So when I say there is no truth, we oftentimes have this statement today. We follow Pilate, right? There is no truth. What is truth, Jesus? What is truth, Socrates? Well, when we say there is no truth, we already enter into a truth claim, whereby we are affirming the statement that there is no truth.
Right.
Now, this doesn't get us far, mind you.
Mm-hmm.
But what it does is it shows me that I can affirm, if you will, that there is something like the truth that I should be seeking after, or there is a truth to be sought, right?
Right.
That's really all it shows me. Whether I choose to take up that project, for what reasons, and why I would or wouldn't, those are different questions. But I think it's an unqualified truth to say that there is a truth, because in denying that, I'm already rejecting my denial. Mm-hmm. Okay, so is that socialized? Well, yeah, it is. I had to understand through the concepts and lenses of the West what truth could be. I had to articulate that in and through a language which is very value-laden, that is drawn into certain ideas over others. I had to discuss that with any number of different people, whether it was through books or through these types of discussions, right? So it's very socialized. And yet, it remains true nonetheless, in that in denying it, we again already affirm it. Mm-hmm. Here's another way. So when we oftentimes talk about socialized truths being therefore untrue, what we have to again do is say what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And if I'm told that I've merely been socialized into saying this, and there's no substance underneath it or to it or by it, or however we want to phrase this, I say, well, you know, whoever says that, you too have merely been socialized into saying that all things are socialized. Again, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. Right. And we can always go to this level of argumentation where we draw out a sort of absurd claim.
And it just seems to, it's just sort of circular.
It is.
Yeah. So how do we get out of that?
We understand that the way that we talk has potential for both truth and untruth. We can be, pardon the term, I mean this in a Frankfurtian sense, we can be bullshitters, mm-hmm. whereby we don't care about the truth one way or another and talk merely for the sake of somehow gaining an image. Mm-hmm. Or we can be seekers of the truth who orient our talk to something like reasoned opinion, grounded in the knowledge that in this unqualified truth, that there is truth to be sought. That's what I opt for. That's the philosophical project of the West.
Right.
and why early Christians, frankly, latched onto it with regard to Christ, who then becomes the Logos, the ground of all truth, that is consummated in creative love.
Right. So let's bring this back to the book.
Yep.
What does this have to do with our discussion of God?
Yep. So good. So we've been talking a lot about these knowledge claims. My claim in this chapter is a fairly simple one, relatively standard in many ways. If we can affirm an unqualified truth, something that's true in any and all situations, and I asserted why, or argued for why I think that's the case, then I think that we have to affirm something like Miyagi God. Mm-hmm. I argued earlier that Miyagi God is the eternal stability point, the eternal identity that allows all things to be true in their truth. So if we affirm something that is a statement, an unqualified truth that itself is unchangeable in all circumstances, it must correspond based on this definition of truth to a reality that grounds it. Mm-hmm. Now, what's that mean? It means we get Miyagi God. It means that we get an orderer of the world who doesn't necessarily care about the world, who doesn't even necessarily have care, who is, if you will, to use previous statements, simply thinks through God's self, if there's even any sort of consciousness in God. Okay. But there is order rather than chaos. That's really what it's an affirmation of. Okay. Order comes prior to chaos.
Got it. Wow, that was very good. So I just want to, I think this has to do with the same sort of train of thought. Mm-hmm. You say on 129 that we assume that we should only take seriously the existence of things that are palpable or measurable. We tend to think that only science has meaningful answers to our perplexing thoughts or troubles and questions. And it goes back, I think, to what we were talking about earlier. But I just want you to reiterate what you mean by that.
We're talking here in the realm of what I'd call meaning right now. And the realm of meaning doesn't lend itself to scientific answers. I can't find some measurable constant that will allow us all to find and buy into some immediate meaning. I think there are consistent answers, but I don't think that the answers are material, nor do I think that they are utilized into some sort of technology, which a lot of scientific insight is. Mm-hmm. So what I'm encouraging us to do is say, look at our way of knowing. If you think a painting is something more than the chemical components that go into making the paint and the canvas, if you think that its meaning is found something like within the life and death of the artist or the interpretation of the artist, or if you think that the meaning of the painting is bound up to a broader cultural critique and understanding, or even if you think that it's bound up in the notion of beauty and the way that beauty busts open the worlds that we thought we knew, then you are not affirming a science-worshiping standpoint. And you have to find a vocabulary, socialized, a vocabulary that allows you to discuss these things seriously.
Right.
God is in the realm of meaning, in the sense that I'm saying that if we see that we have to pursue truth, at least at the philosophical level, then we also must look to live our lives in such a way that we bind ourselves with the truth rather than the untruth.
Right.
At least more so in the usual arena in which we exist, which is that of reasoned opinion. Mm-hmm. And science simply can't do that. It can do that in certain arenas for us. When I want solar panels and I want to make sure that I'm not creating too many CO2s, I can do that. And there's something meaningful to that, which is scientifically unmeasurable.
Right.
So did that answer your question?
Yeah. Yeah. I want to take a moment, talk a little bit, sort of in reference to part of your story.
Yeah.
I think a lot of this chapter is at least an implicit rejection of the expressivist God.
Yes and no.
The God of, like, you know, the fire of the Holy Spirit kind of thing.
here's what I would say. Yes, in the sense that it's a rejection of the usual theologies that are bound up with it.
Mm-hmm.
And I have serious critiques of what has become sort of evangelical theology.
Right.
And I don't think evangelicals even need to be bound up with this, but that's for a different time.
Mm-hmm.
But how God acts and what God does, I'm still, maybe this is the thing that I've retained. I'm unwilling to put God in too small of a box,
Right.
so as to say that God can't act in these ways, simply because I'm uncomfortable with them now. I like the liturgy. I like the order of the liturgy. I love going to Mass, or I used to love going to Mass prior to having children, and being able to know that everything is leading up to the holy peace that we express to one another right before we take at Eucharist, namely when we enter into the very peace of God in and through the crucifixion. That to me is beautiful, and it draws me in continually to the gospel and story of God. But yeah, it doesn't mean that I can just reject these parts. But yeah, you rightly see this chapter as my answer to the story that I've been telling so far.
Good.
And
I just wanted to make sure I was reading that right.
Yep. No, you're reading that absolutely right. And if you will, the next chapter becomes where I found that this story only goes so far, the God of reason.
Yeah. Let's move to that. Let's move to the next chapter, which is the philosopher's preference of PCs to Apple.
Yep.
Why did you choose that analogy?
Because the first time I started using Apple products, and actually they've kind of degraded since then, I was amazed by. I know. Sorry.
I'm a big Apple fan.
I know. I hated him for a long time. I really hated like the sort of cries of we're so much better. I was like, dude, just give me the cheapest possible thing and I'll work it. And then I started working on an Apple. I was like, dude, wow, this kind of functions really well. All the programs actually work with each other, and it's not constantly shutting down. That is awesome, right? And so I was thinking about, this is the way we experience the world.
To all you Samsung folks out there, listen. I
know I switched.
I'm talking to you, Dennis Perry.
It was my final move to switch to an iPhone. Oh man, I knew I bought it.
Good for you.
Oh Lord, I'm still a little bit ashamed, buddy.
It would be so much easier for like the organization of our church if we just switched to a Mac system.
Platform.
Dennis, our senior pastor, he
won't do it.
He's a Samsung guy for life. So
I love it. Yeah. Well, I mean, he is at the level of opinion of preference right now. Do I get to say that? I don't know.
Probably. Yeah.
He needs to move into reasoned opinion here. But the analogy is supposed to work like this. The chaos that I experienced in the PC world is much like the chaos that we experience in, frankly, the world in which we live, right? Most of the time, things are going just fine. Things restart, things reboot, programs open. And then every once in a while, something major takes place. There's an earthquake, or there's some sort of, good Lord, some other genocide that has begun to emerge, and now all of a sudden the world is falling into
freaking famine in South Sudan that nobody pays attention to.
That no one pays attention to. Exactly. That no one the estimate is 1.5 million people are going to die.
Yeah.
That's an outstanding number. Outstanding number.
And it gets zero coverage. There's so little, it just so frustrates me.
That's because they don't have the vocals of either Trump or Sanders. So
it's just so absurd.
I know it is a horrendously sad moment we live in,
yeah.
And yet these moments are so common.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we forget these moments are so common. We were dealing with a genocide, like a human-made genocide in 1992 with Slobodan Milosevic and the Yugoslavian pan-Slavic genocide. We dealt with it again. What year did the Rwandan genocide take place?
I can't remember what year.
Exactly. We can look that up.
Yeah.
We'll get some fact checkers.
I feel like I should know that.
I know, me too. So
I feel bad.
we will hang our heads in shame. Genocides are a part of this world in which we live. So are famines, and so are tsunamis, as we're going to get into them. So the world feels like, wow, is this place really as good as I've told myself it is in sort of the cush spot in my Western American city?
Right.
Or is there just a pile of crap that seems to be spreading around and upsetting any sort of the order that we have? So if the world were Apple, it would all work together in sync and sort of function perfectly. But we experience in many ways a world that is just the opposite of that, namely the PC world, where things are just a little bit chaotic and constantly the chaos of different programmers' visions are emerging into one world that oftentimes elicits contradictions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I was reading on the Christian Century a few days ago, just a short article they really didn't delve into enough, but it was, the title of the article was something along the lines of like, does God what is God about suffering? Something like that, you know.
Yeah.
But it's one of these short articles that, you know, like isn't actually gonna really get to it.
Sure. Right.
But I read it anyways.
Yeah.
And in it there was the story, he's told a story of like some parishioner, like a teenage parishioner, had, like, a car had run a stop sign and, like, you know, essentially run him over. And they had to like have their leg amputated.
Yeah.
Had their right leg amputated. And like a few days later, another parishioner called their family and was like, "Oh, I'm so sorry, but like this is all part of God's plan for X." So,
yeah.
and it like, obviously the parents were like aghast, like is this person actually saying this to me?
Saying that God's plans for salvation depended on this child's death.
Right.
Right.
Well, they didn't die, but like their leg, it was amputated.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, it's point being, why is that language so problematic?
Well, I mean, the reason it's so prevalent is that we look for rational. We think that if we can come up with some reason that we can ascribe to God allowing these things to happen, we can then tie it into God's plans, and we'll talk about this a lot with Hart. God's plans to, if you will, draw everything into a rational unity. Why it's so problematic is because it says that, so when there's the inevitable death of 500,000 children in the Sudan, and we need to keep that proportion in mind. Probably that's the least. There's probably going to be more children than that dying, because it's going to be the children and the elderly who are going to die more. This is a happy way to start the day. God's plans for the salvation of this world then must have depended. God willed those deaths and must have depended on their suffering and death for God to have brought about God's ultimate ends. And that, to us as Christians, or even from the standpoint of Miyagi, seems utterly absurd, especially from a Christian standpoint, though, because we look at Christ and we see him constantly saving people, drawing them out of death, even back into life, but calming the storm, bringing those who had died socially and even were on their way to death physically back into something like normalcy with lepers. Right. And we go, these two things don't compute. Mm-hmm. And so, to go back, I guess, to an earlier analogy, and I think it elicits a real tension, because a lot of Christian philosophers try to argue for theodicy, saying that, well, we have to see that God's purposes are beyond our knowledge, and that God wills these things to draw us into some sort of perfect salvation. And on the other side, again, we're saying with Hart, yeah, but that means that God wills the death of children and their suffering.
Yeah.
And that is seriously not cool.
Right. Yeah. And there was I can't remember exactly what he said, but I don't think it was in that book. It was in another book that he wrote. But it is like, when I look into the eyes of a dying child, like, I don't see God, I see his enemy.
That's
something along those lines.
We will read that line, and I hope we will take that.
It is in that book?
It is
Okay.
indoors.
I couldn't remember.
Yeah, I hope we will take that line very, very seriously, because I think this is the crux of the issue, and really why no philosophical answer will do with regard to the problem of evil. We can give these philosophical answers which try to justify the chaos and evil in this world and say that God is in some ways drawing good out through them, so God needs them. And I think we just fall into utter disarray, because it means calling those people whose child lost a leg, or calling a parent looking into the eyes of a dying child and saying, God wills that for you. God wills for you to die right now, even though I get to sit in my nice Montana home with a cup of coffee and a dog drinking water in the background. I get to sit in this sort of, sorry, you got the crappy end of the stick, but we'll be drawn in together at the end.
Right. To that extent, you say on 155 that God could have gone apple. To which I respond, didn't he?
That's
in
the
Christ?
That is actually my ultimate argument, right? So I'm arguing from the standpoint of a hypothetical here. Okay. What I'm drawing out is the question of the atheist. Mm-hmm. And in this chapter, I want to give the real grounds of a real form of atheism that I honestly do respect and take seriously. Right. And it's the form of atheism that is not science-worshipping crap that we tend to fall into today, but the one that says, why didn't God go apple with this world? Why did God create PC? And I think anyone who is a believer of any sort ought to hear that question and say, yeah. Why not? Mm-hmm. And of course, you're exactly right. Christ is apple, and things were apple. And yet there was still the possibility of free choice, not merely of humanity, but of the created order somehow. Right. We get uncomfortable with talk of Satan, but I've had to reacquaint myself with talk of Satan, because we're not that important, and yet the whole world is in disarray. The entire cosmos in many ways.
Yeah. Jason gave a sermon, I think like 2 years ago, about why we need the devil.
Yeah.
It was
yeah.
one of his better ones.
Yeah.
Anyways, I think that's a great place to end today.
Sounds good.
So, we will be back on Wednesday.
Yep.
For a makeup session or a catch-up session, so we can finish this book, and then we'll be on a 1 or 2 week hiatus.
Yep.
And then we will get back into the real good stuff with David Bentley Hart.
Yep, that's right.
Anyways, Eric, thank you for being with us today. And we'll see you on Wednesday.
Thanks, David.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.